The Barents Sea. Midnight. A Soviet Udaloy-class destroyer slices through black Arctic waters, its hull creaking against the cold. Above deck, the air is a steel blade, bitter, silent, sharp. Below deck, sonar operators scan endless sonar returns, listening for shadows. They're hunting submarines. American ones. Somewhere beneath them, they believe, lies the game. But they don't know the game is already over. 300 meters below the fleet, silent and invisible, an American Los Angeles-class submarine glides effortlessly beneath the surface, its nuclear reactor humming quietly behind rafted insulation. Its hull is lined with anechoic tiles. Its screw, specially designed to emit no blade cavitation, leaves barely a trace. The water around it doesn't ripple. It doesn't echo. It doesn't speak. And yet the submarine sees everything. Hydrophones track every surface ship in a 50-mile radius. Passive sonar records propeller signatures. Onboard computers log electromagnetic emissions. The sonar technician leans back, looks at the screen, and smiles. Above them, the Soviet fleet sails confidently forward, unaware that a foreign adversary is not approaching, but already beneath them. Within the next hour, the sub will pass directly under the flagship of the Soviet Northern Fleet. No alarm sound, no active sonar pings, no contact is made, but photographs are taken. Weapons ranges are mapped. The commander marks coordinates for a possible firing solution, not to fire, but to prove a point. We were here. Hours later, the submarine reverses course, gliding undetected back toward deeper water. The Soviet task force never knows. Days later, at a debriefing outside Norfolk, A.U.S. Navy officer lays the evidence on the table: sound signatures, acoustic logs, full documentation of the entire Soviet fleet's formation. We didn't just avoid detection, he says. We ran a patrol under their fleet commander's nose. Meanwhile, across the world in Severomorsk, Soviet officers continue their anti-submarine patrols, tight formations, active sonar sweeps, trusted doctrine. They believe they are safe, that if an American sub tried to penetrate, they would know. But the Los Angeles class isn't just quiet. It's invisible. And in this war beneath the waves, silence is supremacy. Inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense, naval strategy was built on ironclad logic. Calculated, tested, confident. The Northern Fleet was a crown jewel. Hundreds of surface combatants, dozens of submarines, satellite-linked sonar buoys, and dedicated anti-submarine aviation regiments. In the High Command's view, if any American vessel dared enter the Barents or the Norwegian Sea, it would be identified, tracked, and neutralized long before it could threaten Soviet waters. But that logic rested on one towering assumption: that American submarines could be found. The Soviets believed detection was inevitable, if not immediate. No submarine was perfectly silent. Cavitation, thermal layers, hull noise all betrayed their presence eventually. And if something moved, Soviet sonar would catch it. Surface ships with hull-mounted sonar, submarines with flank arrays, Il-38 aircraft dropping sonar buoys. It was a net of steel and electronics, and in training exercises, that assumption always held. Mock American intrusions were intercepted. Submarine hunter formations closed in and forced enemy units to surface. Soviet submariners trained in precise vector traps. Doctrine emphasized coordinated responses, pincer movements, using surface ships and sub-chasers to corner and crush enemy boats. The confidence was institutional. They believed the Americans were louder, more reckless. That U.S. submarines depended on speed, not silence. That sonar superiority and overwhelming numerical coverage would always win in Soviet home waters. One KGB Naval Directorate report even declared, "No foreign submarine may transit the Barents undetected during alert conditions." But the Americans had stopped playing by expected rules. The Los Angeles class wasn't just quieter, it redefined what silence meant. It didn't wait in predictable spots. It didn't emit signals that could be triangulated. It moved deeper, slower, smarter. It didn't evade the net it passed under it. Still, Soviet admirals clung to doctrine. Their strategic models depended on detection. Their ballistic missile submarines were protected by bastions, heavily patrolled zones in the Barents and Okhotsk seas. The idea was that layered defense would buy time for retaliation, that if war came, Soviet boomers would survive long enough to launch. But that depended entirely on one premise: that American attack subs could be seen coming. By the early 1982, whispers began filtering into command briefings, rumors of American boats slipping past patrol lines, of unidentified acoustic traces, of passive sensors suddenly failing. Each time, the Soviet response was the same: blame the equipment, retrain the crew, reset the mission parameters. No one wanted to say the quiet part out loud, that maybe the enemy had already figured out how to win, and the war would be over long before the first torpedo launched. For Soviet naval commanders, the underwater battlefield was governed by geometry, mass, and sound. From Leningrad to Vladivostok, every submarine officer trained under the same principles: deploy aggressively, control territory, and overwhelm threats with coordinated force. Submarines were hunters, but hunters within a defined grid. Predictable tactics, structured maneuvers. The ocean was a chessboard, and doctrine dictated every move. Key to this was the bastion strategy, designated protected zones for ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, guarded by attack subs, surface ships, and aircraft. In the Barents Sea, the bastion system was layered like an onion. Detection lines, sub-chaser routes, airborne sonar nets. Everything was designed to detect intrusion early and crush it fast. The enemy they imagined was noisy, bold, and slow to escape. American subs, they believed, relied on brute force propulsion and luck. Soviet tactics focused on saturation, multiple sonar sources, constant triangulation, and depth-based isolation. If a U.S. sub entered the bastion, it would be located, stalked, and forced into maneuvering errors. But none of this factored in the quiet revolution. The Los Angeles class wasn't just another adversary, it was a doctrine killer. Its reactor was silent, encased in floating mounts and acoustic damping layers. Its turbines were decoupled from the hull. Its blade geometry reduced cavitation by 90%. Its speed allowed it to evade countermeasures without going loud. And its sensors, particularly the spherical sonar arrays, were more advanced than anything the Soviets fielded. More importantly, its tactics rejected the Soviet chessboard entirely. Rather than engaging inside Soviet zones, Los Angeles-class boats often operated outside detection rings, choosing their own timing. They didn't challenge Soviet hunters, they simply disappeared. Their missions were intelligence, not confrontation. Their weapon was positioning, not torpedoes. Every patrol was a rehearsal for first strike capability to shadow a Soviet boomer and kill it before a single missile launched. Soviet doctrine, which depended on defense, through layered denial, began to rot from within. Internal reports from Northern Fleet exercises revealed disturbing trends: simulated penetrations with zero detection, ghost contacts that vanished without trace, static sonar nets that caught nothing, submarine crews that burned fuel chasing phantoms. And commanders kept asking the same question: where are they? The answer was worse than anyone admitted. They were already inside the bastion, inside the detection grid, inside the protective shell that Soviet strategic stability depended on. And nothing in Soviet doctrine, no pincer maneuver, no sub-hunting patrol, no sonar upgrade, was prepared for that. The year was 1982, and the Soviet Northern Fleet was in the middle of its largest naval readiness drill in 5 years. Dozens of ships patrolled the Barents. Anti-submarine aircraft circled the ice-cold skies. Sonar stations lit up the deep with active pings, blanketing the seafloor in a wall of noise designed to catch any intruder. It was during this heightened alert that the impossible happened. An American Los Angeles-class submarine, USS Dallas, made its silent approach beneath the Arctic thermocline, hugging the seabed like a shadow. At over 650 feet below the surface, it slipped beneath the outer ring of the Soviet sonar network undetected. Slowly, patiently, it drifted closer to the center of the Soviet formation, collecting data. On board, sonar technicians logged acoustic signatures from the propellers of every major Soviet warship in the task force. Above, the surface fleet carried on blind. Then, with stunning boldness, Dallas maneuvered beneath the very center of the formation. A Soviet Kiev-class aircraft carrier escorted by 2 missile cruisers and 4 destroyers. For 38 minutes, the sub remained directly under the flagship, listening, recording, calculating. It had firing solutions on every vessel within a 10-kilometer radius. It didn't need to be there, but it chose to be. When the sub surfaced 5 days later off the coast of Scotland, its logbooks, sonar data, and internal recordings painted a picture that stunned U.S. Navy brass. But even they hesitated to believe it. "It's not just that they didn't see us," one officer noted. "It's that they never even suspected we were there." Back in Severomorsk, the Soviet fleet submitted routine readiness reports. No anomalies, no acoustic traces, no intrusion alerts. Complete confidence. But deep inside the GRU, foreign intelligence summaries began to circulate. American sources were claiming that a Los Angeles-class submarine had violated the Barents Bastion and done so without a single ping from Soviet defenses. At first, Soviet admirals dismissed it as propaganda, until they received a chilling piece of proof. U.S. open-source publications had printed the precise sonar frequencies of a Soviet destroyer squadron. That data could only have been recorded from within the formation. Suddenly, every assumption unraveled. If the Americans had been there once, how many other times had they come and gone? How many Soviet fleets had been shadowed, mapped, and recorded? And how many missile submarines, keystones of nuclear deterrence, had been within torpedo range without ever knowing? The impossible event was no longer an outlier. It was a signal, and it told the Soviets something they weren't ready to hear. Their oceans weren't defended. They were exposed. When the first reports surfaced, Soviet Naval Command treated them like bad jokes. The claim that an American submarine had infiltrated their Barents Bastion during full alert conditions seemed absurd, impossible. The very idea undermined the entire strategic architecture of Soviet naval doctrine. No admiral wanted to admit it could happen, and so they didn't. Officially, the intrusion was denied. Unofficially, it was dissected. Inside the Admiralty building in Moscow, KGB analysts and Navy officers held closed-door reviews. Acoustic logs from the Barents operation were analyzed, frame by frame. The sonar data showed nothing. No anomalies, no unexplained contacts, no breaches. And that was the most damning evidence of all. Because even a failed detection would have shown something, but this showed silence. Some commanders suggested the Americans had used sonar countermeasures or had spoofed Soviet sensors with false pings. Others blamed technical failures, malfunctioning hydrophones, improperly calibrated sonar arrays. Repair teams were dispatched to verify systems, and engineers were told to examine hull coatings and equipment configurations. The conclusion? All systems had been operating within expected parameters, so the official response was crafted. There was no confirmed evidence of American submarine intrusion. Any claims to the contrary were Western exaggeration. Psychological operations. Some called it an attempt to provoke paranoia within Soviet command, but beneath the denials, unease festered. Multiple Soviet captains privately admitted they had experienced acoustic ghosts, faint, transient signals that vanished without trace. Some claimed to hear propeller signatures that didn't match any known Soviet vessel. Others described sonar shadows that lingered near formations but never resolved into a contact. These encounters had always been chalked up to sea anomalies, thermal layers, biological interference. But now, every unexplained sonar reading took on a new tone, not error, but intrusion. Even worse, Soviet intelligence began intercepting NATO exercises in which Los Angeles-class submarines performed deep penetration roles with disturbing success. In one declassified wargame, a single U.S. submarine simulated destruction of 4 Soviet SSBNs within 30 minutes undetected until simulated launch. Still, Moscow refused to shift its stance. To do so would have meant admitting a strategic vulnerability, to acknowledge that their oceans could be penetrated without warning, that their sonar nets were blind, and that their entire doctrine of nuclear deterrence based on the safety of missile submarines in fortified bastions was a facade. Instead, they doubled down. New funds were directed into sonar research. Hull-based arrays were upgraded. Sub-hunting patrols intensified. The appearance of strength was preserved. But inside the walls of Naval Command, the whispers grew louder. They didn't know where the Los Angeles class would strike next, only that when it did, they wouldn't see it coming. By 1983, the pressure to explain the American submarine intrusions had become unbearable. The Politburo wanted answers. The Navy wanted scapegoats. And the KGB wanted a narrative that wouldn't trigger panic inside the Soviet military-industrial complex. They found one. A new theory began to circulate. The Americans weren't evading detection through stealth, but through external guidance, satellite support, ultra-low-frequency transmissions, or perhaps classified undersea beacons. The narrative took hold that the U.S. Navy was cheating the physics of sound by leveraging a network of space-based and seafloor sensors to guide their submarines like precision weapons. In this theory, it wasn't the Los Angeles class itself that was superior, but the ecosystem above and around it. Some even claimed the U.S. had launched a secret constellation of submarine tracking satellites that could see through ocean layers using infrared reflection from the atmosphere. Others believed the American submarines were using hidden deep-sea topography to slide under sonar nets, exploiting underwater canyons like highways. This explanation gave Soviet commanders hope, because it meant the American advantage was external, technological, not inherent. And if it was technological, it could be neutralized. Plans were drafted to develop counter-satellite weapons. The Ministry of Defense initiated classified oceanographic mapping programs to better understand seabed terrain. Radio direction-finding ships began patrolling Arctic waters in search of hidden American signals. But none of it changed the fact that the detections weren't happening. Even with upgraded surface sonar, new acoustic buoys, and full alert formations, American submarines continued to appear and disappear without leaving a trace. The external guidance theory began to crack. If the Americans were relying on satellites, why were they still invisible, even under cloudy conditions? If they used seabed corridors, why did intrusions occur across diverse terrain? Worse still, some Los Angeles-class boats began to show signs of tactical improvisation, surfacing in unexpected zones, maneuvering unpredictably, and demonstrating situational awareness that couldn't be attributed to satellite feeds alone. These weren't machines being guided from above. These were crews outthinking their hunters. The theory that once promised reassurance now became a liability, because it failed to explain the most critical variable: acoustic signature. By 1984, the Soviet Navy was forced to confront a possibility they had long resisted: that the Americans weren't evading detection with magic. They were doing it with engineering, with propulsion systems that didn't vibrate, with hulls that absorbed sound, with crews trained to glide, drift, and disappear. The Los Angeles class wasn't cheating the system. It had rendered the system obsolete. And the theory that once calmed nerves now felt like a joke no one wanted to laugh at. If the Americans weren't exploiting satellites or undersea terrain to evade detection, then the problem Soviet command concluded must lie with the tools themselves. A new theory emerged. Our sonar is outdated. Blame shifted rapidly from strategy to hardware. Moscow greenlit a sweeping modernization campaign. The Ministry of Shipbuilding was ordered to accelerate new sonar arrays, particularly hull-mounted, active and passive systems with expanded frequency ranges. Factory floors from Leningrad to Severodvinsk lit up overnight. Admirals insisted the detection failures weren't doctrinal, they were technological. If Soviet destroyers, cruisers, and subchasers couldn't hear the Los Angeles-class boats, it was only because their equipment had fallen behind. Naval officers quoted figures, decibel drop-offs, hydroacoustic shadow zones, the aging signal processors on board the Udaloy and Krivak-class ships. Within a year, the fleet began deploying upgraded platforms. New digital signal processors were installed. Towed array sonar systems, once the domain of submarines, were fitted to surface vessels. Anti-submarine helicopters received improved dipping sonar pods. The theory was tested almost immediately during a massive Northern Fleet exercise in 1985. A dozen ships formed a multi-ring sonar net in the Norwegian Sea. The goal: detect and track a foreign submarine believed to be operating in the area. Soviet forces ran drills non-stop, sonar sweeps, triangulation protocols, even mock torpedo drops to pressure contacts into revealing themselves. They caught nothing. Not a sound. 2 weeks later, the Americans released declassified footage of a Los Angeles-class submarine surfacing quietly off the UK coast. Intelligence analysts quickly matched the boat's patrol timing to the exact period of the Soviet exercise. It had been there, inside the net, and no one saw it. The upgraded sensors had changed nothing. Because the flaw wasn't in the microphones, it was in the signal. The Los Angeles-class submarine didn't sound like a normal submarine. It didn't produce the usual vibrations, propeller tones, or hull harmonics. Its reactor was rafted. Its rotating components were suspended. Its propellers didn't cavitate. Its sound signature was so quiet it blended with the ambient noise of the sea. More shockingly, the U.S. had tuned their own boats to sound like nature waves, whales, shifting silt. One sub, according to a GRU intercept, had been nicknamed the Ghost Whale by NATO technicians. The upgraded Soviet sonar arrays were excellent at detecting noise, but the Americans had engineered silence. So, Soviet doctrine moved to its final line of defense: denial. They stopped trying to detect the Los Angeles class. They simply stopped talking about it. And the quiet war beneath the Arctic ice continued, one side hunting shadows, the other moving through them. As Los Angeles-class submarines continued to vanish and reappear across Soviet-controlled waters, Moscow turned to the only weapon left that could reveal the secret: espionage. By 1986, the KGB Directorate for Scientific and Technical Intelligence was running dozens of active operations, focused solely on acquiring U.S. submarine technology. Their targets: propulsion blueprints, noise reduction systems, sonar configurations, even technical manuals for crew training protocols. Every embassy tech officer, trade delegate, and intelligence asset from Washington to Singapore was now part of a single mission: find out how the Americans had silenced their subs. But what the KGB uncovered was worse than they imagined. Operation reports trickling into Lubyanka described a multi-layered American breakthrough. The Los Angeles class wasn't quieter because of a single invention. It was the result of dozens of subtle engineering revolutions. Each one small, but together devastating. Machinery inside the submarine was mounted on floating rafts to prevent vibration transfer to the hull. Reactor pumps were tuned to avoid harmonic frequencies. Gearboxes were magnetically decoupled. The propeller, crafted with extreme precision using 5-axis machining, reduced blade noise so effectively that even towed array sonar couldn't distinguish it from background ocean turbulence. The KGB found references to a secret program called Machinery Quieting Initiative, which had been underway in the U.S. since the late 1960 seconds. By the time the first Los Angeles-class boats deployed in the 1970 seconds, the Americans had spent billions perfecting a vessel designed not to dominate the sea but to disappear into it. Even more concerning was what wasn't found. There was no master blueprint, no central system to replicate. It wasn't a single component, it was an entire philosophy of design, one that couldn't be stolen, because it was built into every engineering decision, every training doctrine, every tactical simulation. In desperation, Soviet engineers tried to reverse-engineer the advantage. They modified the propeller blades of their Victor III-class subs. They experimented with polymer tiles for noise absorption. They installed shock mounts and internal dampeners, but none of it worked fast enough. American boats were already generations ahead. In 1987, a Soviet Alpha-class submarine, one of the fastest and deepest diving subs ever built, was deployed with upgraded quieting systems. It was a marvel of titanium and speed, but during its first patrol, it was shadowed for 6 hours by a Los Angeles-class sub that it never detected. By the time the Alpha returned to port, Soviet command understood the truth. They weren't chasing a technology gap. They were chasing a doctrinal collapse. The Americans had built a system acoustic, operational, strategic, that made them invisible beneath the surface. And the Soviet Union, for all its spies and science, couldn't even define the shape of the shadow they were fighting. To the Soviet Navy, the Los Angeles-class submarine was an engineering mystery. But to the U.S. Navy, it was something else entirely, a strategic revolution. The embodiment of a doctrine that fused technology, autonomy, and flexibility into a single warfighting platform. The Soviets had always viewed submarines as tactical tools, ambush platforms, deterrence carriers, or mobile mines. Their deployment was rigid, their doctrine reactive. Orders came from above, engagements were pre-planned. Their subs operated within a doctrine of caution, of constraint. But the Los Angeles class didn't follow that model. It wasn't a ship, it was a system. First, propulsion. The S-6G nuclear reactor gave the sub unlimited range and the speed to outrun any Soviet counterpart. With top speeds exceeding 35 knots submerged, it could escape counterattacks or reposition before detection. More importantly, the reactor and turbines were engineered for stealth, not just power-coated, suspended, buffered, and refined. Second, sonar. The spherical sonar array in the bow offered a full 360-degree acoustic image. Combined with towed passive arrays and flank-mounted sensors, the sub could build an underwater battlefield map in real time, detecting even faint Soviet movements hundreds of kilometers away without making a sound. Third, weapons. Armed with Mark 48 ADCAP torpedoes and, in later variants, Tomahawk cruise missiles. It could eliminate surface ships, submarines, and land-based targets from afar. Its torpedoes used active-passive homing, wire guidance, and variable depth attack profiles. If it got into firing position, nothing escaped. But the true weapon was information dominance. Los Angeles-class crews were trained not only to execute missions, but to interpret and adapt. Sub-captains had deep autonomy, operating under freedom of action protocols in contested waters. They used real-time data from satellite constellations, SOSUS undersea arrays, undersea arrays, and AWACS aircraft when available, but were just as capable of navigating blind, hunting targets alone in the abyss. And it worked. During Cold War operations, these submarines penetrated every Soviet exclusion zone from the Sea of Okhotsk to the White Sea. They recorded boomers, trailed surface task forces, and even sat in wait outside Soviet naval bases, listening, logging, learning. Where Soviet subs were tools of deterrence, American subs were tools of disruption. They operated with overlapping capabilities: strike, surveillance, intelligence. One patrol could collect acoustic signatures, map sonar ranges, simulate an attack, and exfiltrate without detection. And no two patrols were the same. This adaptability rendered Soviet counter-submarine tactics useless. Most critically, the Los Angeles class was mass-produced. The U.S. built 62 submarines, each one an apex predator. They formed rotating hunter-killer groups, supported by Orion P-3 aircraft, surface ASW vessels, and satellite networks. It wasn't just one boat making incursions, it was an entire force, acting in near silence. Soviet Naval Command came to understand, too late, that they were up against more than technology. They were facing a philosophy of war in which flexibility, initiative, and data integration replaced weight of numbers. The Americans didn't build these subs to win a battle. They built them to nullify an entire doctrine. In exercises and real-world patrols, Soviet admirals reviewed the data and saw the same pattern over and over again. Contact lost. Acoustic trace evaporated. Formation penetrated. No counter-detection. It wasn't silence anymore. It was systemic invisibility. And that's when the Soviet Union realized the war beneath the surface had already been decided. In 1987, during a major Soviet naval exercise in the Barents Sea, the stage was set for what would become the most devastating revelation of submarine inferiority the USSR had ever suffered, because this time, the Americans left proof behind. The Soviet Navy had mobilized a high-value unit, 2 Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarines, the largest in the world, escorted by surface ships, and 2 Victor III-class attack submarines. The operation was designed to test rapid deployment and protection of nuclear assets in wartime conditions. Every sensor was active, every sonar operator alert. The KGB monitored foreign signals traffic. It was, on paper, an impenetrable screen. Enter USS Augusta, a Los Angeles-class submarine already in the area weeks before the exercise began. Using bathymetric maps, acoustic modeling, and weather forecasts, Augusta positioned itself on the periphery of the Soviet fleet's expected trajectory. She drifted silently beneath thermoclines and natural terrain, completely passive, with every noise-producing system dampened or deactivated. What happened next was later described in internal U.S. Navy briefings as a perfect intercept. Over a 6-hour period, Augusta moved into striking position. One by one, it marked Soviet ships and submarines. It got so close to one of the Typhoons that its sonar operators could hear the crew moving inside the Soviet sub. Firing solutions were calculated, confirmed, and logged. And then Augusta did the unthinkable. It simulated an attack. Using training software, it fired torpedoes at every high-value Soviet asset. In the formation, 2 SSBNs, both escorts, and a nearby destroyer. Every simulated kill registered. Then Augusta turned, silently exited the area, and surfaced 2 days later off the coast of Norway. The logs were transmitted directly to the Pentagon. When Soviet Naval Command eventually caught wind of the American claim via intelligence leaks and open-source military analysis, they dismissed it outright, until photographic evidence emerged. An aerial image from a U.S. reconnaissance satellite showed the Typhoon group mid-exercise, overlaid with acoustic data that Augusta had gathered down to individual propeller frequency profiles. It was damning. The Americans hadn't guessed their positions. They had been there. The Soviet Admiralty went into meltdown. Emergency reviews were launched. Orders were given to relocate bastion zones farther from known approach paths. New mines were laid. Anti-submarine patrols were doubled. But nothing could erase the core humiliation that, in the most protected waters of the USSR, a single American submarine had entered, mapped, targeted, and withdrawn without ever being seen. No torpedoes had been fired, no collisions, no damage, but the message was clear. If this had been war, the entire Soviet second strike capability would have died in minutes, and no one in the Kremlin would have known why, until it was already over. The Soviet Navy had been built on the promise of parity, a force that could challenge the U.S. Navy, not just in numbers, but in capability, reach, and doctrine. Its submarines, aircraft, and ballistic missile carriers were symbols of global influence and strategic depth. But by the late 1980 seconds, the silent war beneath the waves had shattered that illusion. Every level of Soviet military planning had relied on the assumption of strategic bastion integrity, that SSBNs could hide in fortified zones long enough to survive a first strike and retaliate. That assumption was now dead. The Americans hadn't just infiltrated these zones, they had done so repeatedly, with impunity. And worse, the Soviets had no idea how often it had happened. This realization triggered a doctrinal implosion. Senior commanders could no longer claim their second strike force was survivable. Political leaders could no longer assure themselves that Soviet submarine forces could deter American aggression. The entire foundation of Soviet nuclear strategy, mutually assured destruction, was now tilted heavily in America's favor. But the collapse wasn't just strategic, it was ideological. For decades, Soviet military thinkers had insisted that centralized control, mass deployment, and tightly coordinated doctrine would outperform Western chaotic innovation. They believed in the superiority of their system, the raw tonnage of steel, the rigor of discipline, the iron grip of planning. But the Los Angeles class didn't play by Soviet rules. It didn't follow Soviet patrol routes. It didn't use mass to achieve presence. It used silence to achieve dominance. One submarine had upended the assumptions of an entire fleet. Inside military academies, officers who had spent their careers teaching sonar theory and bastion strategy began removing chapters from their curriculum. "It no longer applies," one instructor wrote privately. "We are teaching countermeasures against ghosts." In response, the USSR poured money into next-generation submarines, like the Akula class with quieter designs and advanced sensors. But they were too late. Even the Akulas struggled to match the acoustic footprint of the Los Angeles class. And by the time they deployed, the Soviet economy was hemorrhaging. In the final years before the USSR's collapse, some senior officers in the Northern Fleet admitted, behind closed doors, that their submarine force had lost the war long before the state did, because for every time a Soviet sub tried to escape detection, an American one had already been watching. And for every Soviet admiral who clung to the illusion of command, there was a U.S. sub-captain drifting beneath his fleet, silent, invisible, and fully armed. The Cold War didn't end with missiles or megaton blasts. It ended with the quiet hum of a nuclear-powered hunter-killer that never needed to fire a shot because its presence alone had erased the enemy's belief in victory. Long after the Iron Curtain fell, after the Soviet hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin, the waters of the Arctic and the Pacific remained unchanged, cold, deep, and silent. But beneath them still prowled the legacy of a war that had never gone loud. The Los Angeles-class submarine never became a pop culture icon like the stealth bomber or the space shuttle. There were no parades, no headlines. It was too secret, too quiet. And yet, it was perhaps the most decisive weapon of the Cold War, not because it destroyed enemy fleets, but because it dismantled confidence. Its missions remained classified, its logs sealed, but its impact echoes in every sonar array, every NATO naval exercise, every Russian modernization program that followed. The submarine that couldn't be heard rewrote the rules of engagement without firing a shot. Today, the remaining Los Angeles-class boats still patrol the oceans, upgraded, refined, quiet as ever. They operate beneath contested waters, beneath adversary fleets, beneath regions where new empires are testing old ambitions. And in the Russian Northern Fleet, veterans still whisper about the boats they never saw, the shadows beneath the ice, the acoustic ghosts that came and went without warning. They know now what they didn't know then. The Americans weren't preparing for a fight. They were preparing to win one that would never start. In a war defined by arsenals and alliances, propaganda, and paranoia, it was a single class of submarine 62 boats, built over 2 decades, that taught the final, fatal lesson. You can't kill what you can't find.